Hi, and welcome back to another one of our online lectures here in World History. Today, as we continue our unit on imperialism to independence, we're going to look at the effects that imperialism had on Africa. There's no doubt that the African continent has dealt with a lot of severe issues over the last couple of hundred years. We've certainly seen genocide in Rwanda, which we'll actually look at in this unit, and genocide in Darfur, which we will also look at in this unit. But you've got the AIDS epidemic, and as of recently, we've got Arab Spring, which we've got revolutions, people fighting against their government. You might be familiar with the Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia in 1993. There's been a lot of really tough situations that have happened in Africa, and most of these you can trace back, at least in some direct or indirect way, to imperialism. Because when the Europeans moved into Africa, they really carved it up and took a lot out of there and never really had any regard for what it might mean for the African people in the future. So we've got one question we're going to attempt to answer here today. The question just says, describe what the European motivations for colonizing Africa were. And a lot of that's going to be financial, of course, looking for markets, looking for gold and diamonds and salt, but we'll also bring in a little bit of the Berlin Conference to help explain that as well. So what will we learn here today? We'll talk about some of the layers of history in Africa that really kind of help make us understand how imperialism in Africa was possible. So that'll bring us to imperialism into Africa, basically the Europeans moving into Africa and taking bits and pieces of it. We'll see how social Darwinism fueled all of that and really talk about what social Darwinism is. We'll focus pretty heavily on the Berlin Conference because the Berlin Conference is one of those events in history that probably shouldn't have happened, but in the end it allowed for the Europeans to really move in and take whatever they wanted in Africa, and we'll see why that occurred. We'll talk about the clash over South Africa, we'll talk about the Boer War, and then we'll end with positive and negative effects of imperialism in Africa. And this will seem very similar to what we looked at in India, so you'll see some parallels there, but a couple of different points will be made as well.
So there's been a lot of trade going on with Africa prior to this time period. We know clearly the Atlantic slave trade was going on. But and that was, of course, for trading for people, which happened here on the west coast of Africa, right in this region. But Europeans are starting to realize there's a lot of really good, important resources that they want out of Africa, such as gold or salt, sugar, and diamonds. A lot of different reasons why the Europeans would want to go in there. So this map shows us a little bit of some of the imports and exports that come out of Africa. This is pre-19th century European trade with Africa. Again, we've got the triangle trade going on here with the slave trade. This would be 1700s. Certainly a lot of trade going on here with the Spanish, Portuguese, French, English, and Dutch. Not going to go into too much detail there, but it's at least a good map for us to take a look at. So let's get into this. Let's set the stage here. We want to look at layers of history. When we want to talk about Africa, we have to go way, way back. The ancient Egyptians and Nubians in the north left Africa with some impressive ruins. I mean, a lot of people, when they think of Africa, they think of Egypt. Of course, when they think of Egypt, they think of the ancient Egyptians. So definitely a connection there to Africa. Later on, right around 400 BC, give or take, you had the Greeks and the Persians who were duking it out in the Persian Wars, but there's also, the Persians had eventually controlled Egypt, and then Alexander the Great brought Greek culture through when he conquered the Persians, so you had Persian and Greek influence in Africa as well. Of course, then the Ottomans come around a little bit later. The Ottoman Empire is going to control a lot of the Middle East, including North Africa, and they're going to bring Islam to the region. So there's a heavy amount of Islam on the continent of Africa today. And of course, one group we can't forget to mention, the Roman Empire. They definitely controlled northern Africa once they were able to defeat Carthage in the Punic Wars. And Carthage, of course, is in North Africa. So what you've got here is a real interesting mix of Roman, Greek, Persian, Islamic, and of course ancient Egyptian history, all in a very small place. I mean, North Africa, because of the Sahara Desert, does not lead itself to a lot of civilization. But I want you to know there's a lot of history here that's definitely evolved. And we could go on to the kingdoms of Axum and all of the different African kingdoms that existed after this, but we just don't have time to go into that right now. But this is some of the outside influence that definitely had an effect on the African people. Now, I'm going to put this all up there. I'm not going to talk about all of this, but when we talk about colonization and we looked at the age of exploration, we talked about God, glory, and gold. There's a lot of reasons why Europeans would want to go colonize. Certainly sources of raw materials to make more money, to find new markets, to sell things and make more money. We're going to talk a little bit about racism today with social Darwinism, Europeans basically thinking they're better than the Africans. There's a lot of social and economic reasons. Sometimes they want military and naval bases in places that the Europeans go. Missionaries trying to spread Christianity. So I know I'm going through this quick, but it's a review of a lot of different themes that we've talked about this year, looking at why somebody would want to leave their country and set up a colony somewhere else. But realistically, it comes down to God, glory, and gold for the motivations. Here's some exploration into and around Africa. We have already talked about Vasco da Gama sailing around the tip of Africa. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the excursions into Africa. But prior to really the 1800s, you didn't see a lot of traveling in Africa. We're actually going to talk about David Livingstone here in blue. He's really going to kind of be the spark that starts this. So let's talk a little bit about this imperialistic idea here in Africa. So prior to European domination, African people were divided into hundreds of ethnic and linguistic groups and continue to follow traditional beliefs. In a lot of ways, what we're saying here is they're made up of tribes. And that's going to be true really even up until the modern age when the Europeans bring a lot of these countries together and start forming boundaries. But the Africans lived in small groups that were more tribal in nature. Some of those people converted to Islam, others converted to Christianity, so you do have both religions on the continent, and some stuck to their native tribal religion, so kind of have a healthy combination there. Now, due to industrialization, Europeans competed for new markets to buy goods. They wanted new stuff. They wanted to make money. And again, that comes down to the idea of finding gold and silver and diamonds and sugar and salt, things that Africa were well known for. So this led to European imperialism into Africa in the 19th and 20th centuries. So we're really talking the 1800s and early 1900s. If there's a market to be had, if there's money to be made, the Europeans were going to try to go there and try to capitalize on that. Now, we've already had a definition of imperialism. We talked about this in the previous lecture, but I think this is another good look at it. Sometimes words can have different definitions that do mean the same thing. So imperialism is the seizure of a country or territory by a stronger country. Both definitions use that word stronger country. Oftentimes they go on to dominate weaker countries socially, politically, and economically. So that's what's going on here. Prior to this, the reason the African continent had not really been colonized by Europeans is because disease in African armies had discouraged European exploration. So Europeans had tried, and some of them had died of disease. African armies had fought them, and they kind of stayed away. But things are going to change here in the 1800s of the 19th century that are going to lead Europeans to move further and further into Africa, and therefore they're going to carve it up and take a lot of it for their own countries. So humanitarians, explorers, and missionaries who were against the Atlantic slave trade were allowed to travel to the interior. These would have been the people who weren't attacked by armies and were able to move further and further into Africa. But it would have been a relatively small number compared to the traders and explorers who actually wanted to get into Africa and make the money. Continuing on, our story really picks up with this man. And in the 1860s, David Livingstone, a missionary from Scotland, traveled to Africa. Problem is, all contact with him pretty much ceased. So people didn't know where he was. They assumed he was maybe dead or killed or something like that. So, feared dead, an American named Henry Stanley decided to travel into Africa to try to look for David Livingstone. And so he found David Livingstone near Lake Tanganyika, and his famous greeting when he found him said, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" Basically asking him, "Hey, are you Dr. Livingstone?" And that became a very world-famous phrase. Stanley's further exploration of the Congo region of Africa sparked the interest of King Leopold II of Belgium, who took control of these lands with treaties and began to exploit the people. So with Livingstone's story and with Henry Stanley going after him, European countries like Belgium basically said, hey, there's stuff there that we want. Let's move in there and try to take it. So it's sort of a famous, fun story to begin with, but the result of it's going to be pretty detrimental, as you're going to find out here. So here's David Livingstone, a little statue created to him. Here's Sir Henry Stanley, as he was searching for Dr. Livingstone. Here's a map. This is of southern Africa, if you can sort of picture this. The tip of Africa would just be south of here. And so you can see here's sort of the path that Stanley took, kind of traveling through here. And he finds Livingstone right here, right on Lake Tanganyika. And he continues to travel all the way through the Congo region and over to the west side. Well, King Leopold, as you see here on his currency, is not going to be very good to the people in Africa. They're going to see an opportunity to make money, and they're really going to exploit the people there. And the reason they want to do this is because of rubber. Harvesting rubber. There's rubber trees in Africa, and so the Europeans are going to move in, and they're going to force the Africans to tap these rubber trees, and they're going to treat them very, very brutally. As you can see, punishing lazy workers by whipping them, or having Africans whip each other. It was very, very brutal, but it gets worse. Because if you look at this image, 5 to 8 million victims, roughly 50% of the population, were either injured or were killed. And I'll let you look at this image for just a minute, and they all have something in common. They're all missing a hand. So that was one of the big punishments. I won't read this whole thing to you. You can certainly pause it and read that. But basically the whole rubber traffic was steeped in blood. The natives were very much maimed and harmed and killed in the process. There's no doubt the Europeans did not treat the Africans in the rubber business very, very well. So we're going to stop there. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about the European motivation and something called social Darwinism. But then we're going to talk a little bit more about South Africa, and we'll end with the positive and negative effects of imperialism in Africa. One of the biggest things we are going to hit on is the Berlin Conference, an event that I would argue should have never happened in history, but it has some major consequences on the African people. So you can go ahead and hit stop and queue up part 2.